Okay, well, as you can see, we've got Thomas Lumley with us here, Dr. Thomas Lumley. Uh, According to his bio, Thomas grew up in Melbourne. He spent 15 years in Seattle before moving to Auckland as a professor in the statistics department at the University of Auckland. He specialises in the design and analysis of medical studies. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand and the American Statistical Association, and is a core maintainer on the R programming language, which is used for statistical analysis and graphing. So welcome along, Thomas. You've got a very interesting title for your talk. So I'll leave it to you to take over, and we will see you soon.
Yep. Okay, so kia ora koutou, and thanks for inviting me. So I've been living in New Zealand for about 11 years now, and 10 years ago, my department at the university started a blog on statistics in the media. And mostly this was to raise public awareness that we even exist. And partly it was as a resource for teachers. Then over time, other people, including journalists and just other people, have become interested in it. And doing Stats Chat, to some extent, has lowered my opinion of newspapers, but it's raised my opinion of journalists. So I think the problem is more about their incentives and resources, and also the loss of context from physical newspapers in some way. So that's the sort of banner from the website. The quotation there is a paraphrase of something that H.G. Wells said, paraphrased by the president of the American Statistical Association in 1951, that statistical thinking will one day be as necessary for efficient citizenship as the ability to read and write. The other quote is a bit more recent. Scott was one of my mentors at the University of Washington in Seattle, and he would say the statistician's task is to go into the light and spread darkness. It's obviously a bit exaggerated, but the basic message is true, that it's easy to believe things. Statistics is a filter for helping you not believe things. So one of the key aspects of statistical reasoning is context for numbers. They aren't just an undifferentiated mass. They have relationships, that you don't just have a big pile of numbers. There's a picture there and it comes from the relationships between the numbers. Context is key to interpretation. Initially, I'd thought that Stats Chat would mostly be about correlation is not causation. But it's mostly, in fact, been about context at more basic levels than that. So I'll talk about some examples of numerical context and trend and variation, and then some of the examples of overinterpretation of biomedical research, which is another area I'm interested in as a medical statistician that I've written about on StatsChat. So we usually care more about rates or risks than counts. Counts are easier to find, easier to come up with, but going for counts can actually obscure the story. So here's an example where figures show that during the past 2 years, a total of 9,703 teenagers were found guilty of drink driving. And they said that Auckland teenagers had the highest number of convictions. Now, presumably that's true, but Auckland is also actually bigger than other cities in New Zealand. And so you'd expect the number of convictions to be higher. And what would be more interesting and more useful as a summary of these numbers is the rate. Auckland is about a third of the population, roughly, and it's a lot less than a third of the convictions. And in fact, if you look at the data in more detail, the rate of convictions is lowest in Auckland. And if you combine Auckland and Wellington, they have about half the national rate. So the story is very different when you look at the rates, when you take into account that Auckland is bigger than Christchurch or Wellington. The story is different, and using the counts gets the story backwards. The context is important. This is a related one, looking at students reported as cheating in high school exams. And so we've got the breakdown by region, no one in the Cook Islands, which is good. Auckland was at the top, but again, Auckland is a big place. And if you look at 159 out of the total of 290, that's a fairly high rate. So the rate in Auckland is higher than the average, but the rate in Northland is much higher. Northland is much smaller than Auckland, so if it's got 25, that's a much higher rate. So again, the story is different when you put the right context in. The other issue, though, is that the overall rate that this comes out as is about 2 per 1,000 students, per 1,000 exams. And that's a very optimistic view, I think, of students cheating. I mean, the rate isn't actually going to be as low as 2 per 1,000, probably. So the other problem is, do the numbers even mean, do the numbers actually tell you about cheating or only about getting caught? And we see this sort of problem in a lot of statistics. For example, statistics on domestic violence or statistics on drug use. The cases that are reported are a small fraction of the cases that actually happen. And that distorts the story, it distorts the message. So normally, yes, we'd want these denominators, and you can look at proportions, and that gives you a better feel for what's going on, a better feel for the actual patterns than if you just look at the counts. But sometimes looking at the denominators can be misleading as well. Is this going to? Yes. So there was an analysis that's been in the media a few times that says that the rate of assaults in Wellington is 10 times higher than the nation's average. There's a few issues with this. The simple issue is that it's not at all what it says. It's talking about the Cuba Street, Courtney Place precinct in Wellington, not the whole place. But also, the denominator, here there is a denominator, but it's the wrong one. The denominator here is the population of the Cuba Street, Courtney Place precinct. And it's not people who live there who are primarily the problem. People who get assaulted in central Wellington come from the whole area. So do the people responsible. They aren't necessarily residents of that area. And if you divide by residents of that area, because you're going to get a very misleading idea of the rate. So sometimes there isn't a good denominator here that's easily available, but the denominator that is easily available is wrong. What you'd ideally like might be some sort of estimate of how many people were there. So if you had data from say cell phone locations, you might be able to work out how many people were in that area and look at the rate of assaults per people out in public. And here it matters because the point of this story, the point of this analysis is to provide evidence about a policy question. And so the policy question is, should more be done to restrict the number, either to reduce the concentration of nightlife in that area, or to reduce, for example, alcohol consumption. And the statistic doesn't answer that question. I mean, you want to know, is that region more dangerous than other places if you're someone wanting to go out on a Saturday night? Or you want to know, are there more assaults than there would be if we took that Cuba-Courtney precinct away? And the comparison that's being done superficially looks as though it's related to those questions, but it really isn't. Another consistent issue is trend. And yes, it is going to change. Lots of things change over time. Some of them even get better over time. Here we've got a picture of the holiday road toll, standardized to a rate per 4 million population. And you can see generally going down over time, but you can see it went up the last 2 years, 2014 to 2015. And so if you just look at that, it looks like there's a big increase. And Ron Mark did just look at that and say there looks like there's a big increase. And so whatever the police had done over that holiday had been a big failure. But if you look at the whole pattern, then the combination of trend and random variation, there's just no real suggestion that anything is happening. And the problem there, it's often the case that there's no real suggestion that anything is changing or changing in a different way, that the patterns are just continuing. And that can actually be the important story. So when the suicide rates come out every year, there are often stories saying that there is a record high number of suicides. But the real story, in my view, is that the rate has stayed basically the same for a long, long time. So it's not that there's been a sudden peak. It's not that things are getting to be bad. It's that things have been bad and nothing that we've done has made any difference. And again, that's an important story, but it's not the story you get if you don't look at the trends. This is another example of trends where, again, the sort of basic rule is that when politicians give you numbers, the numbers are usually right, but they also are usually picked to mislead. And so here we see a reduction in crime, and then on the right, that same reduction in crime in its context. So context is very important for changes over time because lots of things are changing over time. Another important area of comment for the Stats Chat that I wasn't really anticipating was bogus polls, online self-selected polls with no demographic data, so there's no way of matching them up better to reality. And these, as you can see, are pretty useless. So here's one from last year comparing preferred Prime Minister, showing Judith Collins slightly ahead of Jacinda Ardern, whereas the real polls conducted at the same time showed very strong margin the other way. This happens all the time. The bogus polls, self-selected website polls just don't work. They've got no information in them. They're actually worse than useless because of anchoring bias. They affect what you expect, even though they don't actually work. And one problem here is the loss of context from physical newspapers. In the old days, it was easier to tell, is this story in the part of the newspaper you're supposed to believe, or is it in the other bits of the newspaper that are basically filler? You can see how bad these polls are. This is an old poll, 3 set polls from the same leaders' debate before an election. And one poll said it was even, One poll was about 2-1 in favour of David Cunliffe. The other one was about 2-1 in favour of John Key. And these were all on the same night, basically on the same question. Now, you might think that at least they show what the audience of that media outlet thinks. Now, that would be bad because one of the valuable roles of opinion polling is to let you know that your friends aren't representative. But also, it doesn't even work for that. Here are two examples from the same day for the same poll in the Herald. There was a Sikh man who wasn't let into a club in South Auckland because they had a ban on headgear. And at 2:43 in the afternoon, the poll was 2-1 in favour of the club. And by 5 o'clock, it was 58% to 40% against the club. So it's not even a stable measurement of what particular audience thinks. So I have been campaigning against bogus polls, and I think with some success. I think we may have actually reduced the rates. But another important thing is measuring what you care about. And one of the fundamental non-mathematical aspects of statistics is to help people think about what their actual question is and what sort of information would really help answer it. So we remember the Chinese sounding names issue. Someone gave the Herald data on real estate buyers with estimates that lots of them were of Chinese ethnicity. Now, the mathematical bit of this were fine. People called Sui or Xu are mostly of Chinese ethnicity. People called Harawira or Boric or Lumley mostly aren't. People called Law or Lee split in some fairly consistent way. So you can get proportions right. But the problem is that Chinese ethnicity is not the question. The question was about overseas investors, and Peter Thiel is an overseas investor, but not of Chinese ethnicity. My neighbours are of Chinese ethnicity, but not overseas investors. Here, the Herald did put the caveats in the story, but quite a bit further down. We get a lot more of this problem in medical stories, and to some extent, this is the right sort of research. We do care about lab results in rats. Reductionism really does work. We want to isolate small parts of the question to manipulate them. It's a powerful technique. But the answer to that small part of the question isn't the answer to the whole question. And that gets missed too often. Here we've got a story with snake venom could hold the key to Alzheimer's treatment. And this was in vitro sort of test tube research, not even in mice. And also looking at breaking down amyloid protein. It's increasingly unclear that will work. But it was being puffed as a sort of breakthrough. And this is because one of the stories that you can write about science is the breakthrough story. And though science isn't a breakthrough, but it's one of the stories you can write, and so it tends to get written. Over here on the right-hand side in the read more, you can see some of the other recent stories just before that time that have been about Alzheimer's, and they're basically similar. Also, that's the wrong snake. Alzheimer's is particularly bad because nothing actually works, but it's like Aliens, where anything that's dramatic is crop circles and UFOs, and the real exobiology research isn't as impressive. Here's a slightly different sort of problem, completely inadequate data from one experiment, when there's many much larger studies of, in this case, vitamin D, that have been done that just don't happen to give the newsworthy result. And as a final example, the chocolate, red wine, beer genre. Lots of us like chocolate or beer or red wine or coffee, so there's always a market for stories that says they're good for you. And you need a science background for the story. Otherwise, you can't put it in the science label, but you can stretch it a lot. So this one is people were randomized to give in hot chocolate, high in flavonols, which are supposed to do good things, versus sort of placebo hot chocolate that was low in flavonols. And there was no difference between the groups as far as you could tell. But a subset of the people improved whichever type of hot chocolate they were given. And that's a negative result. They were trying to show a benefit of flavonols. But it's one you can spin as chocolate is good. And so especially near Valentine's Day or Mother's Day or Christmas, you'll get stories saying that chocolate is good. And they'll have some sort of science hook, but usually a very, very weak one. It's a type of story that's easy to write and popular, and people don't actually want to know if it's true. So in world historical terms, it doesn't really matter if people do this with chocolate, but it does, in a sense, amount to pissing in the swimming pool of public discourse. It makes it easier to get other topics wrong when they do matter. So unconvincing differences in a subset of a study to be taken as evidence for an important new treatment, which Dr. Rachel Dunlop is talking about tomorrow for Alzheimer's. So in the end, we have the stats chat rules. The sort of prime directive for statistical reporting is that context matters. But here are at least some specific rules that have come out of a decade of stats chat. The first rule, Auckland is larger than Wellington. The second rule, Bat of the Year is the only worthwhile bogus poll. And the third rule, if you're eating chocolate primarily for the health effects, you're doing it wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. That was a fantastic talk. I especially liked your last slide and the way you called it the Bat of the Year rather than the Bird of the Year. Very, 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 very good. Yeah, so I don't see any questions from the chat.
Everybody got worn out by the previous.
Everybody, yes. So, do you have a solution for this problem of journalists misusing stats when I guess it does lead to clickbaity type articles that sell advertising?
Yes, I mean and there's two sorts of articles. So ones that are actually reporting by New Zealand journalists tend to be better, and those I think it's helpful to offer help to people who want to get the numbers right. But there's also a bunch of stuff that's just syndicated from the Telegraph or the Daily Mail or something, and there, I mean, really seriously, nobody actually cares whether it's true or not. That sort of sciencey stuff. And there, I don't have a solution. I mean, I think the problem is that people don't really care.
And I guess the readers are more concerned with reading a story that makes them feel good and supports their existing biases rather than actually finding out what's true.
And it's much cheaper to use those stories than to report new ones. And, it's a lot less work for the overstretched media people. And I mean, until the public actually wants, then wants the right answers, people won't get them. I mean, this is one of the things that's been different about COVID, is that people do actually care whether the information in the media is correct or not, and it by and large has been. I mean,
yeah, it's apparently. I've got a question in here. What is the worst misuse of statistics you have ever seen?
So the worst numerically, I think, was a story that came from the Telegraph in Britain that estimated the number of cod remaining in the North Sea as, like 10 or something. So that was the sort of biggest error factor. They'd misunderstood something about population age structure of cod and how the old ones were sort of vanishing. But that wasn't at least, but that again was that was bullshit. It wasn't, people weren't trying to be misleading. It's just that they didn't care. The setting of people, you get some of the political ads, there was a set of political ads, one of which got taken to the Broadcasting Standards Authority, just graphical ads. And the Broadcasting Standards Authority said, it doesn't matter how misleading the graph is because it's got the right numbers printed on it. That, I think, was one of the worst recent examples of saying that, none of this matters.
Yes, it's the not caring about the truth that is the really worrying thing, isn't it? Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Thomas. It was a pleasure to have you talk.